Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the Cominform and containment policy. Last class, we finished talking about the wartime conferences during the Second World War. We almost finished the spiral distrust between US and USSR to explain their relationship before the start of the Cold War. So, in this class, we'll explain the last stage of this distrust, that is fear and self-protection. So we're going to use this as examples. Firstly, Truman, when after the Potsdam Conference, he soon adopted a get tough attitude towards USSR, which was named Containment Policy. While on the other side, for Stalin, he also gradually tightened his control in Eastern Europe. That is also in response to Truman's policy. He established the Cominform. So why this stage has turned to fear and self-protection? That means the sense of insecurity and the actions of protecting themselves. When we talk about the causes of the First World War, we actually mentioned about how sense of insecurity caused the armament race. So we're having a very similar case here. When a powerful, aggressive force is operative in the international scene, states will feel a larger measure of insecurity. And based on this kind of insecurity, it may lead to competitions and conflicts among different countries. Okay, firstly, Cannon's containment policy in 1946. George Cannon, he was the USA's deputy chief of mission at the US Embassy in Moscow in 1946. He saw the Soviet Union as an aggressive and suspicious and recommended firm action by the USA against what he viewed as Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe. And also, his telegram, which became known as the very famous long telegram, greatly influenced Truman's policies in the Cold War, especially his policy of containment. So Cannon, he thinks Soviet communism and American-style capitalism, they were at odds with each other and were destined to clash. Actually, we expanded earlier when we tried to make comparisons between the capitalists and communists, right? You can see that also according to Karl Marx and Lenin, the conflicts between communism and capitalism, it was unavoidable. This is a different stage of history. This is unstoppable, right? So actually here he's using same kind of idea that since we are so different and caused by some historical theory that we were destined to clash. That means we will somehow have conflicts. That's why we need to prepare for it. So for their part, that means the role of USA in the capitalist bloc actually can be very important and vital. He argued that the Soviets, they would attempt to undermine capitalist societies in the West and aggressively expand their territory unless they were checked by the outside pressure. That means here, firstly, the Soviet Union, which was under Stalin's rule, actually were aggressively expanding to a lot of countries already, especially in the Eastern European countries, like what's shown in this cartoon, right? So for US, their biggest role is to play as an outside pressure, which was to check the expansion, the aggressive expansion of US. So to encounter the Soviet threat, he continued, the United States should contain communism and halt its expansionism wherever it attempted to advance around the globe. So, what does it mean by containment? What was containment? So for a containment, firstly, it shouldn't involve any direct military confrontation. Actually, in first class, when we talk about the definition of Cold War, you should already learn something about why in Cold War there wasn't any direct military confrontation between US and Soviet Union. Yes, they did have a lot of intervention in different civil wars and different parts of the world, but they don't really have some direct military confrontation between them. It's because the atomic bomb, right? Because no one can really afford a nuclear hot war. Remember the MAD? which is short for mutual assured destruction, right? That is the reason why no one can afford a nuclear hot war. That's why, firstly, we should keep alive, right? So they won't really involve any direct military confrontation. So secondly, this kind of containment strategy also couldn't embrace cooperation with the Soviets because firstly, the communists themselves, they're communist extremists. They were not likely to be friends with us. That is also the reason why we shouldn't encourage any kind of cooperation with them. And also, we need to keep distance to them because we need to show others that we disagreed with their ideology and aggressions. So firstly, no direct military confrontation involved. Secondly, cooperations were not encouraged. So what should we do? The answer is unalterable counterforce over the long term. So what does it mean by unalterable counterforce? Unalterable means there's no other choices. We need to stick to the plan. Counterforce means we need to arrange force to encounter their expansion and stop their aggressions. Over long term means this is not like a plan for just few months or few years. This is a long term, maybe several decades kind of plan. So if America steadily resisted uncontained, that means if we successfully stick to our plan, the Soviet expansionism year after year and decade after decade. So the Soviet advance would eventually be stopped. That means what they want to do is play a long game, right? To exhaust them by isolating them by not cooperate with them, but also no direct military confrontation with them, right? So we can actually conclude it as either the breakup or the gradual mellowing of the Soviet power. So we can conclude this kind of containment policy as firstly, be patient and then play the long game. You have to see this kind of containment policy was only a theory until the Greece Civil War. So since 1944, there had been a civil war in Greece with Britain helping the royalist government. So we have Britain on one side, who helping the royalist government of Greece. So on the other side, we have communist forces. And of course, they were all supported by Stalin. But actually, before we talk about it, we already mentioned the Greek Civil War in one of the conferences. Anyone remember which conference? It was the Yalta Conference. It's a time when Stalin, he tried to move the border of Poland westward, right? So in return, he mentioned that he will leave Greece alone. And this is also the reason why Churchill is, at this point, is helping Stalin to get this proposal passed. Because Britain, at this stage, were helping the royalist government in Greece to encounter the communist force. And in this conference, it was actually agreed that Britain, they would have influence in Greece, and on the other hand, Soviet Union, they would leave Greece alone. But actually, Soviet Union had some other arrangement for the Greek Civil War by not violating what he promised in the Yalta Conference. So, after the Yalta Conference, you have to see, instead of supporting the Greek communists themselves, we still remember they have influence in a lot of Eastern European countries, right? So they don't really need to do it themselves. They can ask people to help them. So like here, after the Yalta Conference, I've promised Britain not to intervene in the civil war in Greece. So Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Albania, since you are my satellite states, I help your country to build your communist government, right? So in return, you need to do your part and assist the Greek Communist Party with both soldiers and money, that means militarily, economically, against the British-backed Greek government. Of course, as they're satellite states, there's no space for them to say no. So they agree with it. That is also the reason why in the early age of the Greek Civil War, with the help of Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Albania, these satellite states, the communist-led rebellion threatened to topple the Greek government. That means they almost overthrew the Greek government, the royalist Greek government, just as the British, they withdrew their troops from Greece. So what happened to Britain? In the Yalta Conference, they tried their best to help Greece, right? Even sacrifice Poland, right? So why here they have to give it up and withdrew their troops? So you have to see, for Britain, at this stage, they are facing an economic crisis. Although loans supported by US have been nearly exhausted, because you still have to remember this is like the last stage of the war. You need a lot of money to reconstruct your country, right? And also for Britain, one important fact is they were powerful because they have a huge amount of colonies, right? And all these colonies actually also need human resources and, more importantly, money to remain their colonization. So because we have to keep a large number of troops in Germany, Italy, the Middle East, and Asia, and also at the same time, political unrest in India, Palestine, and Egypt was controlled by UK. Because after the Second World War, we were having the decolonization age, right? That means different countries, they fight for their independence and self-determination. This is the reason why, while these countries, they were having different kinds of political unrest and also long delay in completing the post-war peace treaties. It's already exhausted their money. So maybe I would have to withdraw the troops from Greece to save some money, because we have more urgent players who need this money, right? So bye Greece, hope to see you soon. So at this time, it's seemingly that the result of the Greek Civil War would be the victory of the Communist Party, right? This is a time when, under Containment Policy, US start to fight for the capitalist bloc. Under this Containment Policy and the long telegram sent by Cannon, Truman felt that he had to act quickly to strengthen these non-communist forces in areas that were vulnerable to the Soviet pressure. Actually, at this point, it is about one important definition related to the Cold War history. That is the Domino Theory. It means that when a communist government in one nation was built, it would quickly lead to the communist takeovers in those neighboring states, each falling like a perfectly aligned row of dominoes. So that is the reason why not only they need to act quickly to strengthen those non-communist forces. So other areas won't be turned to communist states easily. And for them, this required money, which had to be approved by the US Congress. So on March the 12th, Truman appealed to Congress, highlighting the increasing divide between the US and Soviet Union, and he outlined plans for financially assisting areas like Greece and Turkey, where the Communist Party were trying to take over the government, which were perceived to be threatened by the communists. And this was the very famous Truman Doctrine. So this is his speech in the Congress. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempt subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. If Greece should fall, confusion and disorder might well spread throughout the Middle East. The Domino Theory, right? It's not only about Greece, it's also about those countries in Middle East. So the free peoples all the world look to us for support in maintaining those freedom. I believe that our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid. In addition, I asked the Congress to authorize the detail of American civilian and military personnel to Greece and Turkey. So it means not only that they were supporting them economically, there still should be some like military aid, right? So provide Greece and Turkey with economic and military aid because they lacked the military personnel to get prepared. So why Truman Doctrine can be very important? Firstly, this marked a new era in the US attitude to the world politics because after the Great Depression, US was constantly agreeing on the isolationist policy. They tried to prevent themselves from involving in a lot of like European affairs. This is also why they absent in those League of Nations, why they absent at the first stage of the war, right? So now, from the Truman Doctrine, you can see their intervention and support to all those European countries. So that is like a turning point for their foreign policies. That is also the reason why it can be marked as a new era in the USA's attitude to the world politics. The US was prepared to send money, equipment, and advice to any country, which was, in American view, threatened by a communist takeover. So at the old times, more like a passive resistance. They want aggressively to stop any of their expansion. They still haven't get tough, right? But after this, the Truman Doctrine, which was under the Containment Policy, they finally start to do something, the self-protection, and even protecting other allies, right? And his aim was to stop communism from spreading any further. So these are the importance of the Truman Doctrine. So now they have the doctrine. They will send money, equipment, and advice, right? So now what they need is a detailed plan about how much money they should send, what kind of equipment, and also whose advice should be sent to these countries, right? So after the Truman Doctrine, firstly, it is the beginning of a new U.S. policy which is rapidly supplemented by substantial economic aid. That means under Marshall Plan, they start to provide economic aid. So in what way Marshall Plan reflecting the containment policy? For containment policy, firstly, it shouldn't involve any direct military confrontation, right? The Marshall Plan is an economic aided plan, right? So it didn't really involve any direct military confrontation. And also, they were helping countries who were resisting communists. So they don't really embracing cooperation with the Soviet Union, right? Actually here, they are attracting a communist country to go back to the capitalist bloc instead, right? So this is how Marshall Plan reflecting the containment policy. You can see a lot of countries, Britain, France, Italy, West Germany, Holland, Austria, all different countries, they were having aid from the US under the Marshall Plan. So what do you think Stalin's attitude towards Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan? I don't think he's kind of person that can ignore all those actions took by Truman, took by US, and he is not that kind of person who can tolerate US using money to lure, to attract the countries to turn to a capitalist bloc, right? That is the reason why, firstly, to respond to the Truman Doctrine, COMINFORM was established in 1947. What is COMINFORM? It actually stands for the Communist Information Bureau, COMINFORM, right? So it was set up in 1947 in order to extend Soviet political control over Eastern Europe. And it was introduced to ensure that the Eastern Europe will follow Soviet aims in economic and foreign policy. So make sure that they won't really follow the Marshall aid, right? So all these leaders of each communist party, they will regularly go to Moscow to brief by Stalin and his minister to make sure that all these satellite states and communist government, they were under control, right? To allow Stalin to keep a close eye on them. They're not really receiving aid from the US. And then, so for Stalin, of course, he viewed national aid with suspicious, right? Actually, the intention of this kind of economic aid was very obvious. My question is, why after the Second World War, during the Second World War, so many countries want to turn to communist government? It was because they were poor, right? Because the poor people, they want to equalize the material from the rich people, right? So for most of the countries, the reason why the peasants and the workers, they were supporting this kind of communist rebellion or communist revolution is because they want to have enough food or enough money for themselves. So for US, since they don't want this country to change into a communist country, they think the most direct way is to give them money, to let the country have a very smooth post-war reconstruction, so that these countries won't easily turn to communist states or under the sphere of influence of USSR. This is also the reason why he forbade any of the Eastern European states to apply for the Marshall Aid. He thought that the anti-communist aims behind the Marshall Aid would weaken his hold in Eastern Europe. And actually, this obvious is the intention of the Marshall Plan and Marshall Aid. And this is also the reason why, to strengthen his hold in Eastern European countries, the USSR, they also offered economic assistance to different satellite states through the Molotov Plan, which is in counter the Marshall Plan. So here we finally finished the last stage for the spiral distrust between US and USSR, that is the fear and self-protection. We have started from the ideology difference to their interactions from the First World War to the end of Second World War to review their relationship, right? From firstly, they have doubts for their difference, to they start to take actions. The Containment Policy, Truman Doctrine, and also the Marshall Plan. So for USSR, they have Com-Inform, they have Molotov Plan, which is to encounter each other for self-protection, right? So this marked as all the causes for the Cold War. Next class, we're going to talk about the Cold War and the different stages of the Cold War. See you in next class.